welcome everyone to this episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and you have clicked play on, we really hope you've clicked subscribe to, a podcast that talks about what we call crucible experiences. Now, crucible experiences, even if you've never heard the term, or if you have heard us talk about the term and we haven't explained it, crucible experiences are those things that happen in your life that, in many cases, knock the wind out of your sails, can take the air out of your lungs. They very, very truly do change the trajectory of your life. They're difficult, they're hard to move beyond. Hence, this podcast, which explores how you move beyond. And that's the good news of this podcast. We're not talking about crucible experiences so we can build a virtual campfire and gather around it and swap war stories and sort of revel in the difficulties that we've had. We talk about them, but we talk about them so that we can spotlight how to move beyond those difficulties, how to chart a course to what we call a life of significance. And the author, architect of that whole structure that I just talked about is the founder of Crucible Leadership, Warwick Fairfax, who's the host of the show and is about to talk right now.
Thank you so much, Gary. Very much looking forward to it.
This is a fabulous episode, and here's some backstory, behind the scenes stuff that you don't know, listener, that you wouldn't know, is that the idea for this show only came up like a week ago or so, and we'll explain how that happened. But to know that it only took a week for it to go from our heads to your ears shows, I think, what you'll discover to be the impact and the import of what we're going to talk about. Because today's guest is Dennis Gillan. And Dennis is a national thought leader on the topic of suicide prevention and mental health advocacy. He travels internationally, speaking, raising awareness, and reducing the stigma surrounding mental health. Dennis has been deeply touched by suicide after the losses of two of his brothers to suicide 11 years apart. After years of sitting on the sidelines, he jumped into helping those in need by working on the suicide prevention hotline when he lived in Chicago. After moving to South Carolina, Dennis got involved with several nonprofits that take on mental health issues, and this allows him to lobby lawmakers and raise awareness by sharing his story. Dennis did a TEDx talk on loneliness and recently started his own nonprofit called the Half a Sorrow Foundation. We'll get into the details of why it's called that and the details of a whole lot more as we go through this episode. But Warwick, take it away with your first question of what I know is going to be a good episode.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for what you do as an advocate for mental health. And obviously you've experienced the challenges and the tragedies that have led you to your calling and what you do with Half a Sorrow Foundation and the Purple File, which we'll get to, which is such a brilliant idea. So before we get to really the tragedies that in a sense that have sadly changed your life in many ways with your brothers, which we'll get into, tell us a bit about what was life for you growing up. Tell us about your family, your brothers. What was, before the tragedies hit, what was your family life, and what was life like in the Gillan household?
Well, thank you for that question, Warwick. And Gary, thank you for the intro. Life was good until it wasn't. That's second generation Irish guy. All my grandparents came in to Brooklyn, New York. So that's where my parents were. So I was born in Brooklyn. And then, like many folks of that era, my dad chasing the American dream here, he moved out to the suburbs. And, the house, the little spit of land. And we ended up north of New York City because my dad worked in the city in a little town called Valley Cottage, New York. It's right on the Hudson River, Hudson Valley, maybe 30 miles north of New York City, in a little town, Valley Cottage, in the county of Rockland. So it's near the Tappan Zee Bridge. If anyone knows that area, that's where I grew up. And it was, what's the word, idyllic. I never get that word right, but it was awesome because I was one of five kids. We had 110 acres of woods behind us that wasn't developed yet. It's now since been developed, but it was like there's a paradise. I lived near the local pool. There were tennis courts nearby. Uh, I walked to school. Everything I needed was in that little pod of Valley Cottage. And I loved being from a big family, five kids. I'm in the middle. There's Sheila, Mark, me, and Janice and Matthew. And it was, classic five people. Count my parents, seven. We had a three-bedroom house. Everybody's crammed in there pretty good. We start moving downstairs and making rooms downstairs. It was really a great upbringing. In memory. Thank God for memory because it's very selective. You remember the good times, you tend to forget the bad times. It was really good. I went to St. Paul's Catholic School, then I went to the public high school. I have lifelong friends from both institutions. Um, to sum it all up, life in Valley Cottage was really good up until 1983.
So was it? Did you say was it your grandparents came from Ireland or?
Yes, all four of them.
Wow, wow, that's sort of amazing. I mean, I grew up in Australia, and obviously the last name Fairfax is pretty English, but my wife's maiden name was Murphy, and her dad was very committed Irish Catholic guy and super good guy. So I always joke if I ever go visit Ireland, I think maybe I'll go under her name. Sort of, it's like, she's a Murphy, okay? Is it okay? So, but
You might
anyway,
find a Murphy over there.
yeah. Well, and as you probably know, there's a Murphy's beer, which is sort of like a rival to Guinness. But a little off topic, I was chatting to an Irish guy once and said, yeah, I think Murphy's is better than Guinness, but Guinness has better marketing. So, there you go. Poor
Each his own.
Murphy's. So, but anyway, so you had an idyllic upbringing in this little town north of New York. Life just seemed to be good. It seemed like, the world, anything could happen. You could continue the American dream of your dad. It's like life was good, and as you rightly put it, life was good until it wasn't. So, tell us about. I guess it was Mark was at the first. So, tell us about that time and that day, and maybe a bit about who Mark was.
Sure. Mark wasn't built for school. He was one of those tinkerers, one of those smart guys that was good at fixing stuff. But you put an academic, you put a book in front of him, it's not going to end up well. And Mark's been on my heart lately because I went through my office recently, and I went through a divorce. So I have all this stuff everywhere, and I was going through my old high school announcement when I graduated in 1981. Now this is 2 years before we lost Mark, and on the back of it, they listed the people that graduated the previous summer, and my brother was one of them. He didn't graduate on time. He graduated in August 1980. I graduated in 1981. So he was on my program, and I did not know that until now. I looked at it like, oh my gosh, Mark is on my program because he graduated later than he should have because he wasn't a book guy. He was a tinkerer. We had a garage full of stuff. He hooked up a CB radio, and that's an old radio for you kids out there that truckers used to use. He hooked up a CB radio to his Schwinn varsity bike, and it ran on a generator that he,
Huh.
rigged up so he could talk and ride his bike on a CB. Like it was like, who thinks of that? You know, that's the kind of guy he was. Um, so I go off to college after 81, and I'm there 81, 82, 83, and that's when the crucible moment number one hit. The phone rang, and it was my younger sister Janice. And Janice says, Dennis, you need to come home. And it's a Wednesday, and I'm 8 hours away at West Virginia University. I'm the first kid to go away to university in my family. And like, Janice, no, I'm exactly where I need to be. And then she told me Mark died in a car accident, which is not true. Mark died in a car, but it was no accident. You all know why I'm here, and the audience is now going to get,
Hmm.
a little taste of what's in my life here. Mark died by suicide. He battled depression for years, and the disease state won. So right smack in the beginning of my junior year, which is kind of technically the middle of my college experience, if you're looking at 4 years, I'm into it, and this is October, and I get that phone call, and I went home, and things were never the same after that.
So you say it was, quote unquote, a car accident. So tell us about, it obviously wasn't an accident. Tell us about that. So was he in a car, and what did he do? I mean, how did he end his life?
Yeah, typically I don't like to speak about means. The car never left the driveway. Let's put it that way. He wasn't
Okay.
driving it. And then, you
Okay.
know,
Okay.
in the suicide prevention world, I try to stay away from it.
Okay.
We will talk about,
Sure.
51% of all completed suicides are firearms. I know that and all that lethal means,
Sure.
but he battled depression for years and
Right.
in the disease state one, Warwick.
Well, and so before that happened, did you ever think that was possible? Did you or your family think, Mark's a great guy, but he's battling, call it demons, call it challenges? Did you ever think this was a possibility?
I think like most people that age, he was looking for his place, looking for his tribe, so to speak. And I don't think
Yeah.
he found it. There was one time I think when he like ran away at an older age, like he's I'm out of here.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't know where he was. So yeah, there was some inkling. But when any time you're dealing with like a suicide or a traumatic event, hindsight is 2020. When you're in it,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to see it. And you're like, hey, you just ran, you'll get over this, it's okay, you'll be fine. And the truth of the matter was he wasn't fine. He was battling something that, they call it the invisible illness. He didn't let us in. Some people tell that, let us in. What's going on? And looking back, there are signs. Now that I'm knee deep in the business of suicide prevention, look back, and that one should have saw that one, could have caught that one, and it's brutal. It's brutal on you when you start thinking like that. The would have, the could have, the should have, and that's why a death by suicide is unlike any other because it's so much like what could I have done? What could I have seen? Like if Mark was driving along and a rock fell down a cliff and took him out, you'd be act of God, just
Right.
man, that's lousy timing, just terrible
Mm.
timing. He was in the highway at that moment. Um, but with the suicide, it was planned out. It was thought about. He was the demons were strong and it got the best of him.
So that's, as you rightly put it, the obviously it's horrific for the person, but the family that's and friends that's left behind, as you say, it's easy to, and you were a kid in college. It's not like you had the knowledge you have now. You know,
Oof.
I mean, you had maybe no knowledge or very little. So, but it's easy to say, gosh, for your parents or your siblings, couldn't we have seen this or that if we'd gotten him counseling, if we'd done this, that, and the other? But it's not obvious if you don't have that training. But so it's easy to objectively say, look, it's not your fault. It's fine. But it's probably a lot harder when you're in the midst of all of that and the emotions, and you're not thinking clearly in terms of there's no way at that age I could possibly have known, right? You
And
don't
that
think
age
that way
for
at the time.
not at all. And that age for me, and I'm not going to speak universally for many of us, but I was 20, and when I was 20, I'll just speak about me. When I was 20, my life was all about me. I was the center of the universe. Everything was me, 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 me. I. Uh, and I think one of the beautiful things about life when you start living for others, yourself dies and you start living to others, and that's where you maybe it takes time, but so I'm always marvel at people that figure that out at an early age. It took me a long time to figure that one out. Um, but at that time, 20, if I go back to 1983, I was just about Dennis having a good time. I was in a fraternity, social. It was all, how can I have the best life ever?
Well, that's normal for kids in college or kids at
Sure.
that age. I mean, so that's totally understandable. So that was obviously horrendous, but as we've mentioned, this wasn't the only tragedy. Um, so how many years later that you got another phone call about
Yeah. If we
your
fast
younger
forward from
brother,
83,
Matthew?
yeah,
Yeah.
Matthew, poor Matthew. 83, lose Mark. 11 years later, now I get out of college. 4 years and 8 weeks, I did a summer session. I'm out. And I
Mm-hmm.
go back to New York and I ended up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, working for a pretty darn good company. I'm doing pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working for Merck Pharmaceuticals, a big pharmaceutical company. I'm a sales rep. I got a great job, married, living in Carlisle. And I remember this day like it was yesterday, like just like Mark's phone calls, those crucible moments, you know exactly where you were when that happened. Um, I was in Carlisle in my living room and the phone rang and poor Janice, it was Janice again. And to this day, I would tease her about this, but to this day, when she calls, my heart skips a beat. Like, is everything okay?
Right.
How's mom?
Right.
How are you? She's like, Dennis, I'm fine. I'm just going to say hi, hi. You know, but she had the bad misfortune of telling me about Matthew. And in 1983, 1994, 11 years later, a decade and a year later, my younger brother Matthew, in a drunken stupor with access to lethal means, dies by
Right.
suicide. That's two. And one is awful, awful. And in the United States, we have 45,000, over 45,000 a year.
Oh,
The estimate's like 130 a day or some crazy number like that. But and you can do all the stats you want. It's mostly white males, blah blah blah, all this stuff. None of that means a hill of beans if it happens to you. And one is too many. And our family got struck by lightning twice, and it was awful.
so I mean, Mark was tough enough, but when Matthew happens, I mean, what were the emotions going on with you, your, I guess, sisters and parents? I mean, there must have been just the level of grief, tragedy, anger must have been at a level that's hard to describe, I'm guessing.
It it's just different when it's your little brother. I'm going to tear up thinking about this. Like, maybe I should have been looking out for him. But I was too busy in my own little bubble. And I'll tell him myself after Mark died. I was 20. I was already drinking a lot, and then I ramped it up another level, to numb that pain. And then when Matthew died, I got drunk the night before we buried Matthew. And I remember driving back home, and I went dark after Matthew died. I mean, really dark. I felt vulnerable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bulletproof. Uh, all the weight of the world was on me, and I'm driving back, and I'm like, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I can't. And I remember hugging somebody at my brother Matthew's funeral, hugging this dude and saying, I did this already. Like, I thought you just checked the
Mm,
box, one and done. I said, I did this already. And when I got back to Carlisle, I was a mess. Happy to report that the night before when we buried Matthew, when I got drunk, was the last time I've ever gotten drunk. So I'm over 27 years sober.
congratulations.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
brother. I appreciate it. I heard your story. We all have our struggles. And at that point, it was just a good move for me. I was as low as I can be. Alcohol, I was depressed, and let's be honest, alcohol is a depressant,
Hmm.
depressant. So do I need to put gasoline on this fire? I don't think so. The fire is kind of raging, so let's let it go. So I just decided to take a timeout, and I'm happy to report the timeout is still lasting. And then I got like a God moment in there. My ex-wife and I were having a little trouble conceiving a child, and that was on our list. We married, had the house, and next up is a kid, and we were having trouble. And I made a little deal with God, and I don't recommend this for anyone, but I said, if we have a child, I'll never drink again. Martin's 26. I'm 27 years sober. Do the math. I'm a man of my word. I don't welch on my bets. A bet is a bet. God provided Martin. I'm sober. I came out way ahead on that deal, and I don't recommend it. But I was in a bad spot.
And one of the
So,
things that
go ahead.
uh, that you said to me, Dennis, when we spoke before this, since you brought up the subject of God and your and somewhat miraculous conception of is you said that you had tried to run away from God and you ended up running to Him. Uh, Unpack that a little bit for folks because not everybody goes through that. That's not for everybody per se, but in your particular case, it's interesting that there were two tragedies, two terrible tragedies, but you have these bookends of I tried running away and then I ran too. What did that look like for you?
Sure, the strong Catholic upbringing helped. It really came in handy, complete with all the Catholic guilt that comes with it. No, it was good. It was good. It was a solid foundation. So God was always on my mind. There were times I ran away, like I can't do this, but I always came back. And for some reason, God always wins. If you're going to get a
Yep.
wrestling match with God, He's going to win. He's going to pin you. He's going to humble you. And I felt extremely humbled after Matthew died. And the way God really stepped into the picture after Matthew was 16 years later, and everything's on God's timetable, not ours. 16 years later, he puts this little bug in my ear saying, tell the story about your brothers. And I was like, no, thank you, God. No, thank you at all.
Yep.
I'm gonna
Been
take
there.
a
Yep.
hard pass on that one, God. What else you got? Eat that cheeseburger. That I'll do. Um, so I spoke at a fundraiser for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I got involved with those good folks, and I spoke for the first time publicly about my brothers, and it was awful. 5 minutes. It was brutal, and I got through it. And I sat down, and afterwards, a lady came up to me and said, "You need to tell that story more often." And I said, "Oh, you just heard the one and done show. That's not happening." But God kept saying, maybe there's something here. Like in everybody who's listening, your crucible moment, maybe something's in there. Don't waste the pain. And I started speaking about my brothers after that. I got a call from a university that said, "Hey, we saw you at that walk, that fundraiser. Can you come speak to our students and interns?" And I bombed. I cried the whole time. They introduced me. I never heard myself introduced this way. Here's a guy who lost two brothers to suicide.
Mm,
That's something I never heard out loud until
mm,
that day. And they go, "Ladies and gentlemen, Dennis Gillan." I'm sitting there, when they're introducing me, I'm going, "Oh, that poor guy. Who is that guy?" And they said, "Oh, it's
mm.
you." Crap. And then I just cried the whole time. So that didn't go very well. Then I got another call from a school that heard me speak at that school. And they said, "Hey, come down." And I only cried half the time. Hey, progress, right?
Twice as good. Twice as good, right?
And then the third time, here's another session where God enters the chat. I went to a Baptist school here in South Carolina, Charleston Southern University. And they said, before our speaker goes on, let's pray for him. And this woman got up and prayed for me. And I needed that. This room was packed. It was 220. The room held 220. There probably was 300 kids in there because it was part of convocation. They had to show up. They had to get credit. And I love that. Normally when I speak or like on a campus or something, it's not voluntary, it's mandatory. You got to go. And they don't want to be there. And I love that audience because I walk into this hostile crowd and I'm going to wow them with this story. But she prayed, and that's exactly what I needed to hear. And from that night forward, I think I had my calling. So I remember driving back and I brought my pastor with me. And he looked at me and goes, "You got to keep going. You got something here. You got to keep going," which I wish he would have said, "You kind of stink at this. You need to go back to your day job." And I'm like, all right, God was wrong.
Yeah.
So I want to go back a bit. I mean, that's an amazing shift. And one of the things we talk about at Crucible Leadership is, at the bottom of your pit, and we actually do use this language, I'm afraid, for some, today will be their worst day. Obviously, you had a couple worst days, but the second one in 1984, that was probably, maybe it was the worst day. It's hard to compare, but when you've got two, it's a whole nother level of tragedy. So for some, they could say, you said you were drinking, they're going to drink or substance abuse. For the rest, I'm just going to either do more of the final solution or I'm just going to waste my life away because I'm going to be angry at my brothers, my family, at God, the world, and you're in this space. Not everybody makes the choice that you did. Some make a different choice when they lose family members like that, and they just get angry and bitter, which would have been completely understandable. But it wasn't like you took years to make that choice. You made that choice like that day. That's remarkable to me. You had every right to be angry and bitter against the world, against God, against brothers, against family. What led you to make that choice to say, you know what, I am not drinking again, and I'm going to move forward in a positive direction? How in the world did you make that choice? Because I find that just absolutely remarkable. It makes no sense, humanly speaking, that you would make that choice at your worst day.
Yeah, the worst out. I made that choice out of absolute fear. I didn't know what was going to happen the next time I got drunk. Was the happy-go-lucky Dennis going to come out, or this guy who's pissed off at the world? Because he's in there. He's in there. They're all in there. And I didn't know which guy was going to come out. So I'm like, you know what? I can control this by keeping them all inside me and not drinking. And the fear factor, I didn't know how I was going to react the next time I got drunk because I was so mad. at what happened. And there's anger and there's, pity, there's sympathy, it's all wrapped up. And I'm like, uh-oh, this thing is pretty wound tight. If I drink, which guy's coming out? And I don't want any of those guys to come out. I want to be in control. And then the deal with God came a couple of weeks later. I said, I don't care what you want. This is what I want. I want a baby. So there was a moment where I said, I'm not going to drink. Then I said, all right, God, this is what, if I don't drink, this is what I want. And then what I wanted, I got. So there's a hope story here. So for all the folks listening, the hope story is, it did get better. And, with the advent of the pregnancy and then the birth of Martin, but it still was pretty bad. And Warwick, one thing I did do, the two things I did that were really smart after Matthew died. One, I stopped drinking because we talked about the alcohol as a depressant, and I went and saw a professional mental health counselor at that point. We had through our work an EAP, Employee Assistance Program, and I used to throw those little brochures out because I already married Mark. I'm like, I don't need it. I'm a guy. I'm good. That's what a waste of paper. And then when Matthew died, I pulled it out of the garbage can and I called and I went and saw a counselor.
And I just want listeners to hear what Dennis has said, because it's easy to think, oh, I'm tough, I don't need it. And guys especially have that mentality, but we're all broken. I mean, I've never gone through anything like what Dennis has gone through, but in my own case, you can't compare tragedies, obviously. But when, losing a 150-year-old family business, causing instability with 4,000 plus employees and anger in family, never meant to hurt anybody, but look, I went through, some counseling back then, a variety of reasons. And, sometimes when there's a lot of money in families, it produces a lot of weird dynamics that aren't always that healthy. Let's just put it that way. So, but yeah, I feel like seeking counseling is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of courage. I said, look, we're all broken. I'm not saying everybody needs it in every situation, but if you feel like, you know what, I keep thinking about this, or I'm crying, I'm fearful, I'm depressed. I mean, it's not rocket science. When I can't sort this out, my wife or husband is not going to, or my partner or my friend. I mean, nothing anybody says really helps. When you need it in your heart of hearts. It's not that hard to figure out. And so it's a sign of courage. I applaud you for that. And really just the courage. I think one of the things that I see in my own life and others is when you go through tragedy, it can make you desert your faith or can make you grow closer to it. There is no in between. You either grow much closer or much further away. And so, I applaud you for your choice, because whatever you believe, and for me, it's my Christian faith. I'm an elder at a non-denominational evangelical church. For others, it could be a different religion, denomination, beliefs. But whatever your beliefs are, when you go through those dark days, you cling to your beliefs. It's not about mine or Dennis's. Whatever your beliefs are, that's where you really have to dig down and cling to it. And that's what you did. I mean, it's truly remarkable of how you came back. So walk us through the years.
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Please go ahead. Absolutely.
Because you and I have different but oddly similar circumstances, in that you said something earlier a few minutes back where you said after Mark died, when Matthew died, you hugged a guy and said, at the funeral, and said, I've been through this once. And I didn't think about it in terms of that until just now. I lost two siblings, and while they did not commit suicide, they both contracted HIV/AIDS. And, that is not very common either, where you get two of them. Yeah. And I know for me, the double dose, first one hard enough. And my brother was the first one. And he actually did pass away from AIDS. My sister died 8 years ago. It was cancer that got her. Treatments had gotten better, but there was something for me, having been doubled up in that way, that made me even more sorry for myself and more depressed. And it was a little bit more dangerous, I thought, for me, because it was doubled up. What was your experience with that? Did you feel like it hit it was a heavier truck that hit you? I can't imagine that it couldn't have felt anything but.
Yeah, the second one, Matthew, especially being the younger brother, crushed me. Uh, Mark, I thought I can get by and then numb myself with the alcohol and other stuff. When
Hmm.
but when Matt died, it was like whoa, and it was doubled. One plus one equals three. In this case, it was just like wow, I can't deal
Hmm.
with this. So, like you, Gary, it it was a crushing blow, and it felt heavier than Mark's. Uh, Obviously, it was because now it's compounded with Matthew, and it was awful. I don't remember going that dark for a long time, And it's funny because each one of us have on this podcast, and everybody listening has their own trauma that they're going through, their own crucible moment, and it's. I never want to get in the trauma Olympics because I've seen that happen before. Oh yeah, you think
Right.
that's bad? Listen to this. Like everybody's got their own, man. It happens. It's
Right.
called life. The highest highs, the
Right.
lowest lows. Um, but I'm sorry to learn about your siblings. What was interesting about when Matt and Mark, because I'm one of five, there's three
Yeah.
boys and two girls, and then I was the last man standing. And that at the time there was no, we were not pregnant at the time, and I'm sitting there, and there's a weird little thing that popped in my head, like you're the last Gillan, you're the
Mm.
last Gillan boy. The name goes through you. I'm like, oh crap, like I need that on me, and
Right.
I'm putting it on myself. It doesn't
Right.
matter. Um, I got two sisters. I got shots here, but I added that one on there, and it was just we're our own harshest critics. I was piling on myself at that point,
Mm.
having missed some of the signs and symptoms of Matt and Mark, and then adding my own burden to it. But uh, those two things we talked about earlier, the sobriety piece, because I was dark, and then getting mental health and work. Thank you for commending the courage. It did take courage to walk in that building. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And for guys, we don't do it. We don't like to do it. And that's why 79% of all completed suicides in the US are dudes. 79%
Mm.
of all completed suicides
Wow.
in the US are dudes. And that is wrong. And you haven't heard me say the word commit yet. I'm probably not going to say it. I say die by suicide. Sometimes we have that connotation. He committed a crime or something. These poor
Hmm.
folks are in a world of hurt at the time, and they see that avenue of suicide as the only way out. And we all know, because we're of sound minds right now, that we know that there's a whole plethora of choices that do not include suicide, but they just see that one route, and that's so sad, in my humble opinion.
So fast forward, I think it was like 16 years after 94 or thereabouts to your talk at the American Society of Suicide Prevention. So, I can relate in one small way. Sometimes when it's about your worst day, somebody says, "Do you want to talk about that? Relive my worst day, the pain. You've got to be nuts." And again, I'm reminded one of our very first podcasts on Beyond the Crucible. We interviewed a Navy SEAL that was paralyzed in a training accident. He was like one of the best of the best. His dad was a Navy SEAL. And I said, look, what I went through is nothing compared to what you went through. He stopped me. This is the guy who was paralyzed, the Navy SEAL, and said, you know what? Your worst day is your worst day. It's not a competition, not a comparison.
Yep.
I've had, we've interviewed quadriplegics, victims of abuse, you name it, all sorts of things, and they all have that view, which is amazing to me. But yeah, I mean, it's, I guess by way of analogy, I mean, there were people that said, "Do you want to write about your story of losing this 150-year-old family business?" I said, there's no way. But then, a little bit, maybe like you in a sense, in a small way, in 2008, I gave a talk in my church, illustrate some sermon about what I went through. And, I'm not Mr. Public Speaker, certainly not back then anyway. It was like 10 minutes or so. And afterwards, people said, your talk really helped me. And I'm thinking, how many former media moguls are there in the congregation? Like none. Sadly, way too many people and families have suffered, whether it's suicide or abuse, cancer. But it's like, okay, well, maybe I should write a book about my story if I can help others. But I remember I couldn't do more than a couple hours a day because it was so painful reliving the memories, that most of it was just my stupidity and my mistakes. It was, again, you can't compare pain, but I could imagine in some very small way people saying, Dennis, your story can help people. You're thinking, I don't care. I am not talking about it. It's way too painful. How did you shift? People might have told you that for years, I'm guessing, leading up to 2000 or thereabouts. How did you actually decide to speak about it? Because it's not
Well,
easy to talk about that kind of pain.
it's a great analogy. Hey, take your worst day. Great. Let's make a career out of that. No, you know what I mean? No.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about that every day. No, it was interesting when I did that fundraiser for they call it AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It felt cathartic, and there was a calling to do something. And then people would come up to you and say, hey, I appreciate that talk. I'm going through some stuff here too. So basically, our miseries have become our mission in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I sat down with this pastor, another guy, and I sat down with him and I said, I wasted all this time. 16 years, I just sat on my rear end and didn't speak about these guys. And I blew it. I could have done more. And he said, no, you were not ready. Those were your days in the desert. And what he was talking about is, the Exodus, where they just
Yeah.
ran around not ready yet. You're not ready yet. You're not ready yet. And then, okay, now here's the promised land. And he was so right when he said that. I forgave myself, or I wasn't ready.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess as Dennis is referring to Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and they want to go to the promised land, but they made a few mistakes, which I guess the Bible calls sin, a lack of faith, and all sorts of other things. And, even Moses kind of wasn't good enough to make it to the promised land, but he saw it, but never quite entered there. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting when it's like, gosh, I could have done more. I could have done, earlier. And you use the word forgiveness, forgiving yourself. Why did you use that word? Because objectively, it wasn't your fault what happened to either of your brothers. Why? What do you mean by forgiveness?
Well, with the suicide or death by suicide, there's a stigma that comes. It's not justified, but it just comes with it. What could you have done differently? Did you see it? Could you have called them? Could you have done this? Could you have done that? And in addition to forgiving myself, I have to forgive Matt and Mark. I have no idea what they were going through at that moment in time, where that pain overrode their ability to be resilient. What was happening right then and there? And we did at one of these walks, they had this balloon release, and they said, Dennis, you got to go over and release this balloon. I'm like, I'm not doing that crap. It's such a guy move. Like, I'm not doing that symbolism stuff. So my ex-wife at the time said, no, your team raised a lot of money. You got to go over there. So I went over there. They gave me a balloon and I said, all right, just think about, why we're here and all this stuff. And right before I released it, and this is where now I believe in this stuff. Like, if you ever have something really bad happen, write a letter to that person and then burn it, even if you don't send it. But this symbolism of letting that balloon go, I said, Matt, Mark, I forgive you. And I let it go. And that was like a big turning point for me, because I was so mad at those two. I used to say to people, when I go to heaven, I don't know if I'm going to punch them or hug them. Just depends on the mood when I die, what's going to happen. So it was really interesting in that way. It's just, now I believe in that stuff. And I also believe in what all three of us have shared, the vulnerability piece for guys. It's okay to not be okay.
I want to make sure listeners hear what you just said, because it's so important. And we do talk about that on Beyond the Crucible. Is you go through a crucible, sometimes it's your fault, sometimes it's other people's fault. And, you have to forgive yourself. We had a woman on the podcast, Stacey Kopass from Australia, and she became a quadriplegic by diving into an above ground pool. Now, she was 12. Clearly, it was quote unquote her fault. But when you're young, you feel like you're bulletproof and you ignore your parents and say, don't do it, Stacey. So she battled substance abuse, and it's like, why did I do this to myself? So she had to forgive herself. And again, you're young. It's objectively saying, look, come on, young people do silly things. But, for everybody that we've talked to, there is no way back from the pit, from your darkest moment, without forgiveness. And you got to forgive yourself. You got to forgive others. Depends on the situation. I get how in your case it was both. But, because that's important. I mean, from my perspective, God loves all of us. Life is a precious gift. And for God to use us in any way, shape, or form, we have to be able to forgive us and others. Life is too important. You can't help anybody else until you take care of yourself, which you've done. both in counseling and forgiveness. It's so important. So I want listeners to hear. So we're at 2000, you're speaking, and I don't know if you mentioned off air that, do you view yourself as like this natural, charismatic speaker that, hey, this is easy, I could speak anywhere, anytime, no notes? I mean, is that an easy thing or is that a challenging thing for you? Because most people hate speaking, to be honest.
Well, God enters the chat again. I was when I was looking for a new career and trying to settle in Columbia, South Carolina, I started attending Toastmasters meetings. And Toastmasters is a group that trains you how to be a speaker. And I was not going to be a speaker. I was not good at it. I tried something at church one time and bombed. And, my leg was shaking and my voice went real high. It was a capital campaign. I was like, my leg's shaking. I'm like, hey, we need money for the church. And I was like, whoa, what's happened to that dude? It would really be nice if you guys could help. And it was horrible. And I'm like, if I want to go somewhere, I got to learn how to speak publicly. So I started going to Toastmasters. Those wonderful people became my friends and started going every Friday morning at this little restaurant called Lizard's Thicket, get breakfast, do a couple speeches. And in a weird way, God was preparing me, going, listen, I got a plan for you. You don't know it yet. And then sure enough, now that when I speak, all those skills that I learned at those meetings where I was just going for a very selfish reason to make connections so I can get another job, now are being used for this job. And I've called on those a lot, and I'd like to think I'm a good speaker. The topic's tough, but there are times, every time I go to speak, I have to peel away right in the beginning. I tell the people I'm working with, say, listen, I'm going to disappear for a little bit. And I go and pray and just say, is this what you want me to do? Because I'm about to do it. I'm going to tear up thinking about this. Like, God, is this what you want me to do? And I always hear it like, get your butt on stage. Let's go. And then I come running back and I'm like, here we go. Give me the microphone.
Again, that's such an important lesson that I obviously wholeheartedly agree with. There's a phrase that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Now, whether you believe in God or some universal power, when you just say, look, I'm going to do my best, but, I'm scared, my, knees are wobbling. God, you got to help me. And from my experience, He always does. And if you go in there saying, I got it, you typically don't got it and it won't go well. So when you go in and say, I don't got it, I'm scared, you're going to have to help me. And you're just being vulnerable and authentic. People yearn for that. And obviously you do. And so I think it's so, you don't have to be Mr. or Mrs. Charismatic speaker to speak or really to do anything. You just got to say, look, I feel called to do this, so I'm going to do it. And then
you can't teach passion. Exactly, Warren.
No.
You can't teach passion. If the person's passionate about it, it's going to come out. Whether they're a good speaker or not, you're going to feel it. And I've seen some really bad speakers who are really passionate about the cause. I'm like, I'm with them. I'm with them.
Now, I want to get to, obviously, Half the Sorrow Foundation and this wonderful phrase, purple file, or this wonderful concept. But one of the things I've found, and I don't know whether you found, I'm guessing you probably have, is my book came out in October last year, October 2021, and I began speaking at young people and business groups. And, I'm, a pretty functional, healthy person. There are always scars when you go through tragedies. But when you have people say, what, Warwick, your story really helped me, a young person, or boy, thank you. We call it a healing balm. There's some level of additional healing when somehow, I know everybody's heard this a million times, pain for a purpose. Somehow what you went through can help others. There is some additional level of healing. I mean, am I guessing you've probably found that, when you speak and people say, Dennis, thank you for sharing your story because that really has helped me. Have you found that in your own life?
Oh, I've had some unbelievable God moments like that, where I'll be done speaking at one school. I got done at 8:00. I got back to my car at 10:30. People want to come up because you're showing them a weakness, which is actually your strength. You're vulnerable on stage, and then they want to share their vulnerability. And the first time it really happened to me was at this huge sorority convention, 600 women in this room, which is kind of funny because I couldn't talk to one of them while I was in college, and now I got invited to talk to 600.
That's so funny.
I couldn't wrap a sandwich, right? So I get invited to speak to these women, and I come down and grab my bag. I went up, got my disc from the my files from the sound guy, and I come downstairs to grab my bag and leave, and there's a line of people waiting to speak to me, and that's never happened before. I'm like, okay, you want to talk to me? And then, yeah, All right. So now I build that into my presentation. I stick around as long as they need me to stick around. And it's been very cathartic for me and them. But once you share your pain, someone's going to share their pain with you. And there's a kindred spirit in that. The vulnerability piece makes us all human. And we can use a lot more of that right about now.
Additional level of healing. So talk about, before we get to Purple Fire, I love that phrase, half a sorrow foundation. Talk about the origin of that name. Where's that come from?
Sure. I believe it's a Swedish proverb. And I was thinking about doing this foundation. Someone gave me the advice. I crowdsourced it on Facebook. I said, hey guys, what would you do if you were naming a foundation? And one guy, a good fraternity friend of mine, David Mulgard, said, don't name it after your brothers. And because everybody else was doing Matt, Mark, Matt, they're doing all kind of variations. And I sat there like, that's interesting. And then I always had this thing in my talk where I talk about a shared joy is a double joy. A shared sorrow is half a sorrow. And it resonates with the audience. That's the proverb, the Swedish proverb. And I was like, that thing hits home. So I started thinking about it. And I said, you know what? The half a sorrow foundation. Because that thing about floored me when I heard it. And it took me forever. I might have heard it when I was a kid. I might have heard it in school. But when I heard it when I was driving in my car at age 50 after burying two brothers, like that meant, thinking about my speaking career, that thing meant all the world to me. A shared joy is a double joy. A shared sorrow is half a sorrow. And
you've lived that, right? It does lessen the agony of the sorrow at least a little bit by sharing it, right?
Absolutely. And I say in the talk, I say, well, a half of a half of a half of a half. I will never get to zero. Right. And that's okay, because my brothers meant something to me. I don't want to get to zero. If I get to zero, we better check for a pulse. It's my time. I turn around, the Grim Reaper's behind me like, yeah, it's time. I'll always have those guys with me.
So talk about what the foundation does, just so that listeners can understand.
Sure. We had a lot of programs that were focused on gathering, and then COVID took care of that. We were doing this men's thing, this men's breakfast, trying to get men together. Again, that's my thing with mental health. Yeah. I do a men's night at the local tennis center, and we do a little talk about mental health. Then we go out and play, because that's how guys talk. They don't talk about stuff like one-on-one. They'll talk like while shooting basketball or playing ping pong. That's how we talk. And the genesis of the foundation was to go to schools that can't afford me. I'm not going to get rich doing this, but I had a call from a kid in Texas one time, and they wanted me to come down there. And this is before the foundation existed. And we couldn't make it work. Budgets, flights, we just couldn't do it. And I had to say no to them. And I remember I was crying after the call. Like, I never said no to anybody. And that was the first time I had to say no. And I said, wow, if I had a foundation that could pay the way. So if this kid ever calls back, I have two questions for him. One, what time, and what do I wear? Because I'm coming, because the foundation will cover the cost. That's where it started.
That's awesome. And speaking about where it started, Gary mentioned to me, and he is, in honor of you, he's wearing a purple, maybe it's burgundy jacket.
It is burgundy, just to be I'm not the Joker.
For those on YouTube. So I love this concept of a purple file that, in all seriousness, I think can be so helpful. Talk about what that is and why that is so important to people, especially when they're not feeling that great about life.
There's Dennis's purple file. He just held it up.
There it is.
Mine's actually blue because I can't find a purple file, but I'm inspired by him to have created one. So.
Warwick and Gary, what happened with that was people would write me notes every now and then. I'm like, how do I capture this? How do I, so I started printing them out and shoving them in this little file. And it's kind of a selfish reason. Again, everything's about me, but I thought one day when I die, my kids will find this file and go, oh my gosh, daddy touched some people. I have two boys, Martin and Brendan. Sorry. But little did I know that I need the file right now, because there are some days I feel like quitting this job. Like, oh my gosh, how much can a man take? Then I go back to the file, and it's a living, breathing file. It's behind me in my office right now. I brought it here. I will open it up and I'll start reading some of the letters that people have sent after the talk, and that rejuvenates me. I'm like, all right, stay on focus, Dennis. It's a bad day today, but it's, we got this. We got this. Keep going. So it's a real source of determination for me. And I think everybody should have a purple file. Just a couple notes, something you got from someone who believed in you, who saw something in you that you did not see in yourself. and I print it out and I read it. I'm old school. I print it. If you have a desktop icon, just call it the purple file, and anyone sends you a nice email for work, you pop it in there. You pop it in there. So it came out to be like a little brag book, but we don't like to brag. It's more of an inspiration file than anything. If you're going to be
Right.
home, just
And I want to bring this to, I want to emphasize to listeners how powerful this is. I found out about this. I found out about Dennis. The current issue that's out right now as we're recording this of Entrepreneur Magazine, he has a column that he wrote in the front of the magazine, short column, um, uh, where he talks about the file exactly what he just said. Here's a quote from Dennis's column. When I consider quitting, I grab the file and come back with renewed determination. And then he says, do you have a similar file? It didn't take me, I mean, I was in bed reading this and I already started pulling things together before I went to sleep that night. And I just want to bring this home to listeners about the kinds of things that can go in there and that do exactly what Dennis talks about. In my day job, when I'm not co-hosting this show, I am a public relations guy. That's what I do. My job is to get clients coverage in the media. That's not the easiest thing to do. Sometimes you pitch clients to go in the media and the media doesn't want to feature them. That can be those moments that you just described, Dennis, where you just kind of want to quit or like, why am I doing this? I'm banging my head against the wall. It's not working. I'm going to read a short note that I have in my purple file, inspired by your article in Entrepreneur, that on those days I had it on my wall, still do. I made a photocopy for the file, but this is what it says. It's from June 2018. And this is a letter written to me by two people I represented pro bono, whose eldest son murdered their two youngest children. Okay, so let that sink in the kind of sorrow that they were going through. Media was very interested in wanting to talk to them. They went to church where I used to go to church in Colorado Springs. The pastor at my old church connected me with them, and I represented them to the media, got some coverage of their hearts to make sure that they got treated fairly. This is what they wrote to me in June 2018. Gary, thank you from the depths of our hearts for your strong support in us. Your guidance and counsel has literally saved us from much more pain and confusion in a world where we feel lost and blind. You became our eyes and voice in the media and public. You have become our friend. Thank you for always listening, always praying, always encouraging us into Christ. We are eternally grateful to you, truly. Don't give up doing what you do in PR, unless God tells you, parentheses, because you mean a lot. Your value and worth is remarkable. It's priceless. Your passion is beautiful and inspiring. We are so beyond blessed to call you friend. Gary, we love you and thank you in the name of the Father, God, and Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. There is no journalist on the face of the planet who's going to tell me no when I pitch Warwick or somebody else. That's going to win my head and heart into a bad place when I've got something like this that I have in this inspired by you, Dennis, purple file. That's the power of having a purple file.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Karen. That is just so powerful. I want listeners, again, if you haven't got it already, you should listen carefully. I don't have a purple file yet, but conceptually, as I think back, in our dark days, having those messages of hope. I remember when the company went under, and I do have a file with this, people would write me letters. These are people I didn't know, readers of the main paper we had, Sydney Morning Herald, and I had people, just somewhere in Sydney or elsewhere. It's like, you don't know me, but, I'm so sorry what happened. The company going under, we're praying for you. And I've got a bunch of these letters of people. I don't know who they are. I've never met them, probably never will. It's like, wow. I mean, now that I'm speaking, people come up and say things, which is very heartwarming. I did a podcast, a Harvard Business School alumni podcast. I had a couple of messages right after, guys saying, yep, I'm some, private equity guy, and I just found out that, my sort of $100 million company is going under, today. And I don't know what I'm going to tell my wife and kids, and, I've sort of lost everything, and thank you. I mean, those things, they mean those words of encouragement during our dark days. One of the things that we do, it's not at the same level as the Purple File, but it's a family thing we do, is every birthday we go around, and I have two adult sons and a daughter in the middle, and we go around and say, what is it we admire about, whoever it is. And I've got two of my kids are writers, and so in addition to what they say verbally, they write cards, typically paragraphs. So, I have those things over the years, and just that sort of love and affirmation from your kids. It's one thing to say, I love you, Dad, which is great, but I love you because A, B, C, D, E, F, in great detail. So, yeah, during our dark days, those are what I call drops of grace. Everything is spiritual for me, so I think, thank you, Lord, for those drops of grace, those affirmations that say, hey, I'm not perfect, but thank you for that encouragement, because it helps us get through those dark days. If you believe in light and dark, and, we're studying spiritual warfare in our church at the moment, which is certainly not my favorite subject at all. But if you believe there is a battle there between good and evil, which most religions say, when those dark thoughts come, prayer, reading your Bible, whatever it is, but also remembering the affirmations from people. Those are also, I think, tools from above to help us sustain those dark days. So Purple File, if you don't have one yet, make one physically, virtually. Don't forget those good words in those dark days. So important. So thank you so much.
Let me jump in and add one more thing here before the captain gets on the microphone here. Because I want to ask you this question, Dennis, and it goes in exactly what Warwick was talking about the importance of affirmation and why the Purple File is so powerful for people. You said this phrase a couple of times when you were speaking about Mark and Matthew and how they passed. You talked about how the disease state won. That's what led to them, to their deaths. The disease state won. Is it fair to say that a Purple File, those kinds of affirmations that point out the things that you do right, that point out why you should keep going, that those are some of the things that you can use to keep the disease state from winning?
I totally believe that. Great point, Gary and Mark. Thank you for sharing that you're going to have a Purple File soon, because you got enough content already. I think that's, it's part of your self-care plan. Self-care is not selfish. That's like a buzzword in the industry, but we got to take care of ourselves. And I think the Purple File is a great way to do that. If you're feeling down and out and you've got this file of people that believe in you and wrote stuff, grab it. That's part of your recovery process. Let's keep exactly what you said, Gary, keep the disease at bay. That's, the Purple File started out, my brag book, think much of yourself, Dennis. It's now become like a self-care book. Hey, Dennis, keep going, man. These people, they have faith in you. You may not have the faith right now, but those folks in that file do. And Gary, that letter you have for the pro bono work you did for that family, nobody's going to tell you no and ruin your day now. It's
Absolutely
not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Never.
They don't own your headspace, because that letter is taking up all that headspace, and it should. It's awesome.
Amen. That sound you heard, listener, was not just Dennis making a good point at the end of his sentence, but it was the sound of the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, which indicates we're going to have to land the plane here in a bit. Before we do that, though, I would be remiss, Dennis, if I did not give you the chance to let listeners know how they can learn more about the Half a Sorrow Foundation, more about your speaking, more about you.
Sure. I am transitioning between two websites. I have one that's my name, DennisGillan.com.
Not Gillian, right? It's Dennis, Gillan.
That's right. And you've had experiences spelling your last name. I get it. So we're going from that one to the halfasorrow.org. That's where we're going. It's funny. I was doing all my speaking under my own business, and you know what? It's bigger than me. So we're going to create a foundation so I can actually get other speakers, do more programming. So I'm migrating. I love the Dennis Gillan site. It has my TEDx talk on there. We moved a lot of that stuff over to the halfasorrow.org site. And you can see my TEDx talk on both of those now. But that's where we're going. That's where you get a hold of me. I do monitor both of them and all the emails that come in, request to speak and all that good stuff. And it's it's been quite the journey, and I'm looking forward to many more years of this. So, and run into guys like you know, we put an article out there, an entrepreneur. I hope somebody reads it, and next thing you know, a week later, I'm on a podcast talking to two guys who have had similar trials and tribulations, and in the end, we all have them. So, I thank you both for bringing me on.
Warwick, the last question or questions are yours.
Well, thank you, Dennis, for so much. I really appreciate your message of hope. And as we close, there might be some people listening today. They might have had family members who've committed suicide. I hope and pray this is not the case. Maybe there are some folks that have those thoughts. Maybe it's not suicide. Maybe they've just, today is a horrendous day because of what somebody did to them, or tragedy, maybe mistakes they've made. What would a message of hope that you would give listeners who today, they might feel like today's their worst day? What message of hope would you offer them?
I had really bad worst days, and everyone did. And like I said earlier, we don't want to compare the trauma Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
Your worst day is your worst day. But I'm here to tell you, better days are coming. And it sounds trite, but I couldn't see out of that darkness when Matthew died. I couldn't see it. There were days if I got up by noon, that was a good day. We started the day, oh, I'm up by noon. I get it. I get in that dark place. And what's that old poem, in the valleys that I grow? Believe it or not, let the grief do its work. Whatever you're grieving, let it do its work. And hopefully this work, when it's completed, you'll come out the other side a more compassionate human being. I feel everything now. The highest highs, the lowest lows. I feel them all, and I'd have it no other way. Before, I try to numb all that stuff. When Mark died, I try to numb feeling, the lows, but I ended up numbing the highs. I numbed it all. And just suicide is not an option. I'm speaking from the heart about this. I'm going to cry thinking about this. It's a horrible option because you heard on the podcast what it did to me and my family. It wrecked us. Let's be honest. For years. And going forward, we recovered sort of, and we're still on this journey by the grace of God. But if I could tell you this as anything, just take that one off the table. Just take that one off the table. Sorry, that's not an option. You pop in your head, you can chase it out. And sometimes the purple file helps you chase it out too. If you go look at a note, chase it out, and let's stick around, see where this thing ends up. And typically, you on this podcast, you've heard crucible moments. People will say that was the worst day of your life. Yeah, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it changed me into a better person. And I've heard that a million times. Would you change anything about that day? No, I wouldn't change a thing about that day because of who I am now. So tell your listeners and everyone watching this, just take suicide off the table, push it aside, stay with us. And time does have an amazing way of healing. But when you die by suicide, you throw away your best ally, time. Stay with us.
It is, it's a wonderful problem to have when the guest takes your job of closing the show. Dennis, that was a perfect summary of not just our discussion today, but what we talk about at Beyond the Crucible all the time. And that is that crucible experiences are extraordinarily painful, but they're not the end of your story. You learn the lessons from them. You pick yourself up, dust yourself off, keep moving forward. And far from the end of your story, they can become the beginning of a new story that leads to unimaginable joy and fulfillment. I believe, I hope I'm speaking, I can speak for you when I say I think you feel that right now yourself. That's where you're at. You've learned the lessons of what happened, and you are living your best life. That's what we hope for all of you listeners. So until the next time we're together, do remember that your crucible experiences aren't the end of your story, that they are the beginning of a new story that can be the best story of your life. Because at the end of that story, where the GPS is set to when you take that journey, is what we call here at Crucible Leadership a life of significance.